we have already talked about speech acts theory in module 7 of the course entitled Pragmatics and Discourse Analysis. Now, we will talk about speech act theory 2 in module 8. Here we will discuss indirect speech acts. As we have seen that there is a difference between sense and force of an utterance. In many cases, the sense is the same as the force. But in many cases, sense is different from force and force is something else. So, U is different from S. In other words, the utterance has a different meaning from that of the sentence. The sentence has the sense and the utterance has the force. The force may be different from the sense. To quote Searle, in quotes, indirect speech acts are cases in which one illocutionary act is performed indirectly by way of performing a direct one. How do we understand this? That a direct speech act is being performed so that there is a force in that utterance. At the same time, an indirect speech act is being performed which is a different one from the direct force. So, direct and indirect speech acts can be performed in the same or through the same sentence. An indirect speech act refers to an utterance in which one says one thing and means something else. For example, it is very hot. This sentence has a propositional meaning, that is, about the weather conditions, that it is hot. It has a direct force of declaring something. So, the speaker declares that it is hot, and that is the direct force of this utterance. However, it may also have an indirect force, and that indirect force may be of requesting someone to switch on the fan. So, the same utterance can have two forces. One is the direct force of declaring that it is very hot, and secondly, the indirect one of requesting someone to switch on the fan. This is an indirect speech act being performed by means of the utterance, "it is very hot." Therefore, we may conclude that the same thing can be said in different sentences, or different things can be said by one sentence. If we take various sentences, we can see that there is an utterance, there is a sentence form, and there is a speech act. Sometimes sentence form is equal to speech act, that is, they are the same. At other times, the sentence form may have no relation whatsoever to the speech act. The speech act may be something which is not contained in the sentence form at all. Let us take an example, shut the door. Now, shut the door is an imperative sentence, that is, the sentence form is imperative. Now, what is the speech act being performed? It is that of ordering. Now, that is the direct force of the imperative shut the door. However, if we say, "Can you shut the door?" then there the sentence form is interrogative, and there the direct force is that of requesting. If we have, "Would you mind shutting the door?" the sentence form is again interrogative, and it is a polite request. So, the force is that of requesting. If we say, "That door is open," this is a declarative sentence. It has a declarative form, but its force is that of requesting. That is, in this kind of condition, "that door is open" is an indirect request to the hearer to shut the door. That may be that the condition in which such an act is felicitous is that there is a need to shut the door. So, there may be other conditions prevailing, which is it may be hot or cold, and therefore, the door needs to be shut, or there is too much noise, and so the door needs to be shut. So, a sentence like that door is open is a declarative sentence in its sentence form, but it is an indirect speech act, and that is the act of requesting. Then we can have another kind of sentence. Why do people always leave the door open? Now, that is again interrogative in sentence form. Why do people always leave the door open? And it has an indirect force, speech act force of illocutionary act that is being performed here is that of complaining as well as requesting. This is much more complex. We see that here a question it's not really a question. Why do people always leave the door open has the nature of complaining and then also requesting that the door be shut. Or take another variation, there's a cold breeze coming into the room. Now, there is a declarative sentence form. In this sentence, there is a cold breeze coming into this room, but it may be taken by the hearer as a request to shut the door, since there is a cold breeze coming into the room. So, this sentence also may have an indirect force of requesting, even though the sentence form is declarative. We can see here that there can be more than one force in a sentence or an utterance. That is, an utterance may have a sentence form of one kind and a force of another kind, and not just one force, but it may have many other kinds of force in it. So, we come to the idea that there is a multiplicity of indirect speech acts in an utterance. Let's take another example. The ice over there is very thin. This is a sentence. The ice over there is very thin. First of all, it can be an act of observation about the ice, which means that it has a declarative force. Declarative force is that of observing that the ice is very thin. Secondly, the same sentence can be a warning to stop someone from stepping on the ice. So, if the speaker says the ice over there is very thin, it is an indirect way of warning the person not to step on the ice. So, the sentence would have an indirect force of warning. Thirdly, it could also be a suggestion to someone who needs to dig a hole in the ice to get fish. And so, it would be telling the hearer that the ice over there is very thin, so you can go there to get the fish. This means that there can be three different forces in the same sentence, the ice over there is very thin. The first is the direct one, which is that it is a declarative, that is the act of observation about the ice. Secondly, it is the warning, and thirdly, it is a suggestion to someone. There is also a difference between who can make a statement or a declaration or a suggestion or a complaint. Let's take an example of a sentence such as, can we move the fridge from here? I'll repeat it, can we move the fridge from here? Now, if spoken from a tenant to the landlady, it would be a request for permission, because it depends upon the relationship of the speaker to the hearer. So, the speaker, if the speaker is a tenant, the tenant can say to the landlady as a request, requesting permission, can we move the fridge from here? However, if the landlady says to the tenant, can we move the fridge from here? Then that can be a request for action. So that would have a different force if spoken by a speaker who needs to request some action and does not need to request permission. So we come to the point that there are multiple meanings in speech acts. An utterance may have a force that is directly related to the sentence form, as well as a force which is indirect and not related to the sentence form. There may be more than one force indirectly expressed. As we saw in the example, why do people always leave the door open, which can be understood as a complaint about someone's lapse in leaving the door open, and at the same time a request to close the door. One force may lead to another in this way. By asking this question, I am complaining about people leaving the door open. I do not expect you to repeat the mistake. Therefore, I am requesting you to shut the door. So what do we have here? By asking this question, I am complaining about people leaving the door open. So there is the force of asking, there is the force of complaining. I do not expect you to repeat that mistake. Therefore, I am requesting you to shut the door. So there is the force of requesting. This is what we mean by the multiplicity of speech acts. We can also see that indirect speech acts can also be indeterminate. That is, it may not always be possible to decide how many forces are there in a particular utterance. There may be one or two or more. The indeterminacy of indirect speech acts may arise when the hearer may not understand or might not understand the indirect force. Let's take a familiar example. Can you pass the salt? This is a more conventionalized utterance, so there is less indeterminacy. What do we mean by conventionalized? It means that this is the normal or customary way in which people speak. So some utterances may become conventionalized. They are a conventional way of saying and doing something. Can you pass the salt? Is fairly conventionalized. So there is less indeterminacy here. No one is likely to mistake this as a real question about somebody's ability, whether they are physically able to pass the salt or not. Everybody will take it as a request and will do the needful, that is, they will pass the salt. So conventionalized utterances are easier to determine, and they lead to a predictable effect. We talked about the perlocutionary effect, that is, it leads to the perlocutionary effect of the hearer doing the action. However, if we have a sentence like, did you taste the food? Now that is a less conventionalized utterance. Perhaps nobody might be able to infer from that utterance that the speaker intends the hearer to pass the salt, because the sentence form does not contain anything about passing the salt. So there is no mention of passing the salt in this sentence, nor is it a conventionalized way of saying so. Did you taste the food is indeterminate. It could be interpreted by the hearer in different ways. It has more indeterminacy. Perhaps the hearer could answer yes or no to the question, did you taste the food, interpreting it as a real question, or the hearer may reply in a counter question, oh, is there less salt in the food? Which means that the hearer is trying to understand the exact meaning of the speaker. Or the hearer may even get annoyed at this question, did you taste the food? And may take it as a kind of a criticism of the food. So this is an example to show that there can be indeterminacy in the force of the speech act, in indirect speech acts, and this indeterminacy comes from the lack of a fit between the sentence form and the force, that is, the sense and the force. The sentence goes one way, the force goes another. There's nothing in the sentence form which tells you that this sentence can have this particular force. So it leads to indeterminacy. So the reasons for indeterminacy are the lack of explicit performatives. So if somebody does not really declare or say that this is what they are doing, then it is open to interpretation. Secondly, there can be a lack of contextual knowledge. The linguist Leach says, quote, "Any background knowledge assumed to be shared by speaker and hearer, which contributes to the interpretation of what a speaker means by a given utterance, is the contextual knowledge," unquote. That is, that the background knowledge which is shared between speaker and hearer contributes to the interpretation of what a speaker means in an utterance. So this is the role of background knowledge. And finally, the speaker wants to create an implicature. That is, that the indeterminacy may be because the speaker wants to create some kind of implied meaning and therefore is not really stating what he or she means and is using a sentence which is different from the force which he or she intends. Another reason could be politeness. There is a relationship between indirect speech acts and politeness. The more indirectly a request is made, the more it tends to be polite, because indirect requests maximize the degree of option to the hearer. So one of the reasons why speakers use indirect speech acts is to be polite, since it may be that using a direct speech act would lead to some impoliteness. But we can say that even rudeness can better be expressed indirectly. That is, if a speaker intends to be rude but does not want to show that he or she is being rude, then that speaker may use an indirect speech act. For example, if a speaker says, "This shirt is nice and better than what you normally wear," such a sentence has a direct force of declaring and complimenting the hearer on the nice shirt, but it is actually being critical or rude in commenting upon what that person normally wears. We may also understand that the intonation of a speaker may be creating indeterminacy in the speech act. Speech acts may also be used for emphasis. If we have a sentence such as "smoking kills," it has a different force from another sentence, "do not smoke." Do not smoke is an imperative and it conveys a warning, and we might say that that is the best or the most effective way of telling someone not to smoke. However, "smoking kills" is another very effective way of warning. It is an indirect speech act. It is a declarative, "smoking kills." It can be seen as a version of another sentence, "If you smoke, you will die." But that sentence has a conditional clause in it, "if you smoke." "Smoking kills" is effective as an indirect speech act, even though it has the direct force of a declarative, "smoking kills," and indirect force of warning a person not to smoke. The preference of a sentence like "smoking kills" in advertisements against smoking is for emphasis. Similarly, we may have questions such as, "Can the sun rise in the west?" In such a sentence, we have a knowledge that the sun cannot rise in the west. So we could have a declarative sentence that the sun does not rise in the west. If we use a question in an interrogative form, can the sun rise in the west? It is not really a question. It has the indirect force of declarative rather than of questioning, since it does not have the force of questioning. It is not intended to be a question at all. So, the grammatical form does have a role to play in choosing whether something has to be uttered directly or indirectly in terms of its impact on the hearer. The choice made by the speaker of a particular grammatical form would be dependent on what emphasis is needed by the speaker in terms of its perlocutionary effect on the hearer. Let's take a few more examples. There is a sentence, "Waiter, there's a fly in my soup." This is a declarative sentence. Waiter, there's a fly in my soup. We do not expect the waiter to take the direct force of this utterance, which is that of informing, so that the speaker is not wanting to inform the waiter that, "Look here, there's a fly in the soup." Well, there is a force of informing, but along with that, there is an indirect force, which is that of complaining. And this is subject to the same felicity conditions, that is, that the waiter is the person responsible for that. The waiter is going to do something about removing that complaint, and that the waiter is in a position to do so. There is something wrong in the soup which necessitates this complaint. So, the indirect speech acts here are those of complaining and also of ordering or requesting the waiter to take the necessary action. Here we can see that the direct and the indirect forces are both present in that sentence. Let's take another example. Can we have some silence here? We have an interrogative sentence which is a questioning, which has a questioning force, that is, the direct force is that of questioning. However, the indirect force is that of requesting. Third sentence, "Shouldn't you phone your mother?" Now, here the interrogative force is that the interrogative sentence, it has the direct force of questioning, but the indirect force is that of ordering. That is, the imperative is there. In the imperative need for phoning your mother is suggested in this kind of utterance. In a sentence like, "Do you take me for a fool?" there is an interrogative and it has the direct force of questioning. "Do you take me for a fool?" has the direct force of questioning, but we cannot really say that it is a question. The indirect force is that of declaring, that is, "I am not a fool." In another sentence, "Tell me your name," the utterance has an imperative structure. It also has a direct force of command. However, it also has the indirect force of requesting, though not very polite. Politeness could be increased by adding "please" while retaining the imperative form. On the other hand, "Could you tell me your name?" is an interrogative, not in imperative form, but it has both the force of requesting and commanding politely, and this is a fairly conventionalized utterance. To summarize this module on indirect speech acts, we can make the similar distinction between sense and force. Sense coming from the grammatical form and propositional content of an utterance, and it is to be distinguished from force, which is the illocutionary act. In indirect speech acts, there is a force which is separate from sense. If an interrogative is used to make a statement or a request, it is an indirect speech act. If a declarative is used to make a request, this too is an indirect speech act. Many indirect speech acts are conventionalized or set ways of saying something. In the same way as many direct speech acts also have the conventionalized performatives. In indirect speech acts, the actual performative verb is not visible, yet hearers can interpret the force rightly, as it is a convention to say something in a particular way. Other motivations for using indirect speech acts are politeness, emphasis, or generation of implicature. Context is important in the successful performance and interpretation of indirect speech acts.